Welcome to my video for a finger joint gift box. For this build I used a couple different materials. So I used hardwood for the top and the sides, and I used plywood for the bottom. I had a magnet, some felt, and some foam board for the core. Of course I always use safety equipment, so I've got ear, eye protection, and some dust collection. So I cut the finger joints. You'll need to make sure and label the top joints. You'll want to align the tops of one side to the joint cutter and the top of the other side off by one kerf so that you have this offset on the tops of each side. I used the long sides to have the edge that was even with the kerf, and I used the short sides to have the one kerf cut off the top. After I completed those joints, then I glued it all together. I used regular wood glue, made sure and get the glue deep down inside the joint. That's what gives the joint the strength. And then I used some clamps. I had a band clamp that I used to clamp it all in place, and I used some other clamps to give it a little bit extra hold while it was gluing up. It takes about 24 hours to glue, for the glue to dry and set. So while I was doing that, waiting on the glue to dry, I went ahead and carved some other things. So I'll show you some of those carvings here in a second. Do want to have a mallet handy because these finger joints can be really tight. So it's good to have a mallet to pound those in before you clamp it up. And make sure you don't put your clamps directly on the joint, just put them right next to the joint. Otherwise the joint won't close up all the way. So you'll see I had to move that clamp a little bit. And then I went ahead and cleaned out some of the squeeze out just to make sure it didn't dry in place and mess up the stain. Okay, so while I was waiting, I went ahead and tried my hand at carving. So I took a picture of my kids and burned it into the wood, and then broke out my carving tools and started just carving away at it. It didn't turn out so well. Apparently I don't know how to carve mouths and tongues. You can tell my son, he looks pretty good, but my daughter looks more like a zombie trying to bite his arm off. So that didn't... We'll see if he appreciates that or not. Also, while carving, make sure you've got something, if you are going to attempt the carving, make sure you've got something to push the board against. So I just made this little jig that goes over the edge of the workbench, or in this case, my footstool. And that way I can press against the edge there and make sure the wood doesn't move while I'm carving it. While carving, be sure to keep the blades really sharp. You'll notice I've got the blade sharpener down there below. Use that quite often while I was doing this carving. Did take a couple breaks during the video, so you probably don't see the sharpening, but I did the sharpening quite often. And I used a couple different tools. So I used some big tools to do the bulk of the work, and then I pulled out some smaller tools to use for the hair work and the face, because it needs a little bit deeper gouge and a little bit skinnier V tools. So a couple different sets. And if you guys have any good suggestions on carving videos, please put them in the comments. I could always apparently use some more videos on carving. I need some more practice, especially on facial carving. I think I did all right with some of it, but the nose and the mouth on the girl didn't turn out very well at all. Okay, next add the magnets. So you'll want to make sure the drill bit matches the diameter of the magnet, and then you'll also want to make sure that you put some kind of tape or marker on there so that you don't drill too deep, because if the magnets are too deep they obviously won't be attracted to each other. First time I tried it, I tried to use screws on the top and magnets on the bottom. That wasn't strong enough, so I ended up having to use magnets on both sides, and have to make sure that you get the polarity right, otherwise the lid will push away from the bottom instead of being attracted. Next I sanded, used some 150 and 220 grit sandpaper on here, made sure and get the joints all nice and flat. And then once that was done, then just sanding to take out the scratches from the orbital sander. And you'll notice I also use a little mat on the bottom. That makes sure that the woodwork doesn't get scratched up more by the table surface as I'm doing the sanding. And add it on the plywood bottom. Next I stained, and so for the staining I used a Danish oil, and I was going to use polyurethane and regular stain, but it was just too cold. The polyurethane wouldn't set up, the garage just wouldn't get warm enough to use polyurethane. So I stained everything with the Danish oil, let it sit for about 10-15 minutes, then came back and wiped all the Danish oil off, and I gave it a pretty good seal. And then I was able to use a spray-on polyurethane. It just gives it a real thin coat, and just to make sure it's got a good seal on it. And then I cleaned up my brush and accidentally dropped some of the mineral spirits on the wood, so I had to go back and restain the corner there, but that came out alright. Next I cut some felt for the bottom. My plywood only had one good side, so I used felt to cover up the bad side. Also, I wasn't sure what surface this box would be sitting on, so I wanted to make sure it had some protection so it wouldn't scratch up whatever it was sitting on. And I just used regular old white school glue to glue this on. Nothing special there. And then just kind of put it off to the side and put some pressure on it for a little while, and let that set. And then if you want, you can make a foam core insert. And I just think this gives your box a little bit better customized look and gives everything a nice tight fit. One thing to note here, I was trying to use my roller cutter for this, and apparently I'd used my roller cutter to cut a lot of fabric lately, and it was kind of dull, so that did not work out very well at all. The corners ended up being frayed instead of nice and straight, so I ended up having to go back and recut a lot of the edges with a sharper razor blade. And so usually what I use is just a regular old, one of the break-off razor blades and a ceramic sharpener, and that way it gives a nice clean cut. Here you can see there's a rough cut on the right and the clean cut on the left. The rough cut was so bad you couldn't even glue it up. It just wouldn't work, so I ended up having to recut quite a few pieces just to get a good solid connection there. And then I used the clothing straight pins to reinforce while the glue set. So I placed everything in place, got it all cut, and then glued it all together. And just do really thin strips of glue, put it down, and then use the straight pins to reinforce it, because you don't want to try to clamp the foam core, it'll just squish it. So the straight pins do a great job of reinforcing that. Also keep a napkin handy, that way you can get all the squeeze out off of there so that it doesn't look too bad. And make sure you get your lines nice and perpendicular. As you see, I tossed one piece off to the side because it was crooked, and it was to straighten it out it would have been too short to use. So that's the nice thing about having this placemat that has the lines on it, and my cutting guide that also has lines on it. I can get everything nice and straight as long as I pay attention. If you don't pay attention, well, that's too bad. And then once it was all glued up, I just flipped it over, put some weight on it, and that allowed it to set up properly. Before it did that, obviously, I made the rest of the inserts. And so I just put some of the pieces from the gift in there so I could see where to cut, and added some extra lines, and of course pinned those in place as well. And then I also made a topper to go on top of this, and so I just made a cutout that goes right on top of it, and then a little square to glue to the top of that so that he could easily pull the topper out and get to the components down below. Hope you enjoyed my video. If you did, please subscribe so I can know if I should make some more. Thanks!